And let's talk about life history evolution. Life history is basically all of these stages that an organism goes through from birth to death, and that includes reproduction as well. Evolution does not only shape the phenotypes of adults, it shapes the trajectory that their lives take, the stages that they go through, the length of time that they go through them, and the strategies that they use for reproduction. Richard Dawkins has kind of become an a-hole in recent years, and he's probably best known in the wider community for being a very outspoken atheist. There's a book he wrote called The God Delusion, for example, that pretty much pulls no punches there. He is also an evolutionary biologist, and he came up with a concept that he calls the Darwinian demon. And that's an organism that would be born sexually mature, produce huge numbers of high quality offspring throughout its life, and would also live forever. It would be absolutely perfect at the task of making copies of its genes and spreading them. Dawkins's point is that no such organism can exist, for the simple reason that there's only a finite amount of resources on the planet. I think I've already quoted that somebody worked out that if you had two fruit flies and let them breed and their offspring breed all that they were capable of, in a year, you'd have a ball of flies the size of the earth. That can't happen because there's a finite amount of energy, there's a finite amount of biomass present, there's a finite amount of food. And so Darwinian demons like this simply cannot exist. The natural limits that come with living in a universe with limited energy and matter force living things to evolve in such a way that they make trade-offs. You know, every every dietary kilocalorie that an organism puts into growth is a kilocalorie that's not available for the production of eggs or sperm. Every kilocalorie that an organism puts into, let's say, defense is energy that's not available for food finding. And everything that humans have ever invented, you have to trade things, you have to make trade-offs. Much like designing a warplane, airplanes that are really fast may not be able to carry much armor. Airplanes that are, heavily armored may not be able to move fast. Airplanes that are beautifully adapted for very high altitude reconnaissance can be extremely dangerous to maneuver on the ground. That was the case for the U-2 reconnaissance plane, for example. And so what designers of military hardware have to do is try to assess what kinds of threats their planes and ships are going to be facing and design accordingly and build the trade-offs in such a way that their designs are well adapted for what they might face on the battlefield. And with organisms, it's the same thing, except there's no designer. Um, Part of the way that organisms adapt to the environment is allocating different amounts of those limited pools of energy and resources towards reproduction, growth, longevity, defense, mobility, all of these things. All of these things have to be balanced in some way. And life history theory examines how organisms evolve to balance those things and make the trade-offs that they do. So we talk about a continuum between fast and slow. Organisms range from, at one end of a scale, you can have very fast development, short lifespan, and very high reproductive rates. In the plant world, these would be weeds. Uh, develop very fast, don't live very long, crank out ridiculous numbers of seeds. Dandelions would be an example. Right, each dandelion produces hundreds of little seeds, um, and they sprout up seemingly overnight on your lawn. So those would be the ones that are fast. Slow organisms develop slowly and don't reproduce fast, but they may live very long. You can, of course, have organisms that are in the middle, but Darwinian demons, which would have fast development and long lifespan and high reproductive rates, it's very unlikely and probably impossible that those could ever evolve. That's an example of something called an evolutionary constraint. I sometimes get questions along the lines of, why didn't evolution ever evolve a, I don't know, titanium armored rhino that could shoot laser beams from its eyes or something like that? And the answer is that evolution cannot magically create organisms just because you think they would be a good idea. There's different types of constraints. You can't evolve something that breaks the laws of physics. So we're never going to evolve an organism that flies faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. Yeah, we're never going to get birds breaking the light barrier. Uh, you're not going to evolve Darwinian demons because they would ultimately violate the laws of, the conservation of matter. You can't get infinitely good organisms with a finite resource base. You also organisms may not to be able to evolve certain phenotypes simply because of the weight of past adaptations. Um, when you develop from a fertilized egg to an adult, there's a whole set of genes. Actually, there's multiple sets of genes um, that lay down the basic body plan of what an organism is going to look like. Where's the back and where's the belly? Where's the head? Where's the tail? Where do the limbs go? And so on. And what seems to be a feature of this genetic toolkit is that vertebrates get born with 4 limbs, um, 2 arms and 2 legs. Now, those limbs can vary quite a bit. The 4 limbs can evolve into flippers or they can evolve into wings, for example. But you're never going to get more than 4 limbs simply because the developmental machinery that lays down the basic body plan very early in development um, is so, how do I want to put this, is so basic to the way that vertebrates develop, is that it would be extremely difficult to alter it. It would be like, I don't know, it would be like replacing the foundations of a skyscraper while the skyscraper is still standing and people have to work there. That basic genetic architecture of how you build a vertebrate body is kind of stuck on 4, which is why, by the way, we're never going to evolve Pegasus, because Pegasus would have to have 6 vertebrate limbs, 2 horse front legs, 2 horse hind legs, and 2 bird-like wings, which are modified vertebrate legs. So I hate to break it to you, but Pegasi are not going to evolve. And that's because of an evolutionary constraint. Earth ponies, sure. Unicorns, quite possibly. I don't see any way we can get the Pegasi or the alicorns. So Applejack is biologically fine, but Twilight Sparkle is impossible. Right. Anyway, getting back to that fast, slow continuum, here's two ends of the continuum. Up at the top, um, that is the vertebrate with the fastest known life cycle. The turquoise killifish lives 1 to 5 months in the wild, but it can complete its life cycle in 14 days. 14 days from mama laying eggs to the babies growing up and laying their own eggs. Um, Sort of the other end down below, that's a Greenland shark. And we don't know huge amounts about them because they're not easy to observe living in deep Arctic waters. But fairly recently, we were able to do some dating on uh, the skeleton of Greenland sharks. And we now know that they might take over 150 years to reach sexual maturity, while their lifespan may exceed 400 years. So up there at the top, that is that's at the fast end. Down below, the Greenland shark is way over there at the slow end. The difference has a lot to do with environment. Turquoise killifish live in temporary pools in Zimbabwe. And for much of the year, these dry up completely. In much of the tropics, the seasons don't alternate between summer and winter so much as they do between wet and dry. And in many parts of the world, you alternate between a wet season and then in the dry season, your sources of water might dry up completely. That happens out of the tropics as well. That happens in California, for example. You have these pools that fill up in the winter and then dry out in the summer. Animals that are adapted to live there um, have to be able to resist drying out. And in the case of the turquoise killifish, their eggs can resist drying, but the adults may only have a few months to complete the life cycle. And so, as soon as a pool fills up, the eggs will develop and develop into adults as fast as they can. And the adults will go through this very accelerated life cycle because they may only have a couple of months before um, the pools dry up again and the adults won't be able to survive at all. All that will live will be their eggs. Greenland sharks live in an environment that is much lower energy, much less productive. There's less food, but it's also much more stable, we think. As I've said, it's not very easy to study Greenland sharks because they live in the deep water Arctic. But there again, you've got much less food available. Lower temperatures mean that the metabolisms of everybody concerned are probably quite a bit slower than they would be for something like a turquoise killifish. But you don't have the Arctic, drying up every 6 months. Although if global warming continues, maybe, well, we probably won't, but I don't know. But at least up until recently, that environment has been pretty much unchanging. Very steady temperatures just above freezing all year round. So there you've got selection that's favored a much slower growth rate because there's less food, but a much longer lifespan. When the environment fluctuates a lot, you get things like this, and this is kind of gross, what I'm about to explain. This is an antechinus. It's another one of those Australian marsupials that charmed Darwin so much. You might remember he was astonished at the way that Australian marsupials look like placental mammals, even though they're not. Even though they're not placentals at all, they are, marsupials. You have marsupial moles and marsupial cat-like predators and marsupial gliding mammals like flying squirrels and marsupials that look like anteaters, and marsupials that look like wolves, and so on. Well, this is a marsupial that looks like a mouse. This is Antechinus. And Antechinus is famous because it's the only semelparous mammal. What the heck is semelparous? If you know of semelparous animals, the most famous would be the salmon, because semelparous animals in general grow, store up energy, reproduce all in one great big bang, and die. So salmon will spend several years growing in the ocean, storing food and growing large, and then they all swim upstream, usually to the very stream where they were first spawned, lay their eggs all at once, and then die. I'm assuming you've heard of this story. Well, the species of Antechinus, and there's more than one species, I think there's about 10, are the only cases where you have semelparity in mammals. And here's why. In Australia, someone once told me that Australia doesn't have any top carnivores. You know, you've got kangaroos that do the grazing and things like that, but you don't have any marsupial lions that are, you know, the apex predators. At least you don't now. And he pointed out that the top carnivore in Australia was the drought. It's the driest continent. It sits directly astride a global desert belt at 30 degrees south. And in the habitat of Antechinus, there'll be one rainy season, and that's correlated with one huge seasonal surge in the population of the insects that Antechinus eats. So food is scarce for much of the year, and then you have this month-long insane boom in insect populations, and Antechinus suddenly has more food than it knows what to do with. You know, Antechinus is suddenly dropped into the middle of a Golden Corral buffet, or the equivalent. And here's the thing, Antechinus females have large litters, averaging about 8 per. There's an Antechinus female with some babies that are still hanging on. And Antechinus has to produce lots of milk. Lactation is a very significant investment of energy. It is for humans as well. The anthropologist Jared Diamond worked out that a mother who's nursing twins is burning as much energy as a recruit in basic training. Okay, sorry, I had a, never mind. So Antechinus needs to crank out huge amounts of milk for its large litters. And the only time when Antechinus females can get enough food to be able to do that is in that 1 month-long seasonal insect surge, which means that there is a pretty narrow window where Antechinus can give birth. An Antechinus that gives birth outside of that insect surge is likely to lose her baby. She just won't have enough food to be able to produce enough milk for them. So that means that birthing has to take place in a very narrow time window, and that means that mating has to take place in a very narrow time window. So male Antechinus during their lives will build up these huge reserves of sperm, and when the mating season kicks in, the males stop eating, they crank their sex hormones up to 11, they crank their stress hormones up to 11, shut down the immune system, and start mating, mating 24/7 continuously for a period of 3 weeks. It, you know, the thought of, you know, being able to last that long might sound very romantic and a kind of I don't know, Marvin Gaye sense, but it actually ends up being more like Cannibal Corpse, great death metal band, because by the end of 3 weeks, the males are just completely used up. They've got no reserves of body fat left, having shut their immune systems down. They're covered in gangrene. The hair is falling out. They're pretty much falling to bits, and they're still trying to mate. Um, Male Antechinus put absolutely everything they've got into one 3 week orgy and then die. And that's because of, well, selection. All Antechinus babies have to be born in this narrow time window, so mating has to take place in this very narrow time window. And what selection has favored is, males that make the most of this one chance that they've got. Um, a male that doesn't mate in this time window is never going to get another opportunity. A male that does not take advantage of passing his sperm on during this narrow time window is never going to get another chance at it. So selection has favored males that put all of their energy into cranking out sperm and impregnating as many females as possible, even if they end up dead, rotting and falling to pieces at the end of it. Now, an Australian biologist named Diana Fisher has actually looked at different species of Antechinus. Remember, there's something like 10 different ones. And the ones that live in the tropics in the north of Australia, remember, it's the southern hemisphere, so they're tropical areas, the north. In the tropics, there is much less seasonal variation in the food supply. There's more rainfall, there's a more even food supply. And in those species, males sometimes do, in fact, survive. Um, the lifestyle is not nearly as extreme. It's in the grasslands to the south where the food supply varies more sharply. And the species that live there have males that always die after, this 3 week marathon of mating. Um, and in fact, in Antechinus species where, okay, here you've got on the x-axis, you've got body mass in grams. You've got the log, the logarithm of it. And up here on the y-axis, you've got the log of the width of the scrotum. Okay, Blaine, sorry I didn't see that until just now. So on the y-axis, you've got the size of the scrotum, and on the x-axis, you've got size of the body. And the open circles are the measurements of males in species where the males do not always die. And you can see there's a regression line right there. That's the relation between body mass and testes size for males that for males of the species where the males don't always die. That's the regression line for the males that do always die. And you can see that males that belong to species that do always die have larger testes relative to body mass than males that don't. And again, that's resource allocation. Some Antechinus males, are only going to get one shot. And so, sorry, I've got this mental image of Antechinus males saying, I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. And the males that cannot throw away their shot have been selected to put as much energy as possible into that one shot. So they grow bigger testes and they crank out more sperm. Males in species where they're not guaranteed to always die, those might get a second chance. So selection has not been as strongly in favor of allocating energy to growing big testes. Selection has allowed, I guess, organisms to allocate just a little bit less energy to their testes and more to, other things. And yeah, good to see somebody's a Hamilton fan. My kid is a big time Hamilton fan. Okay. You can also see some of these trade-offs between reproduction and other functions when you look at species that are dimorphic, meaning that you've got two or more phenotypes. This is a cricket that's common along the Atlantic and Gulf coast of the US. This is Gryllus firmus. You're looking at a short-winged cricket right here. Gryllus firmus comes in two different phenotypes, some of them short-winged and some of them long-winged. The difference is apparently due to inheritance at multiple genes. You can see that short-winged cricket right there. The wings only come, this far back. This is a long-winged cricket of the same species, and the wings come all the way back to the abdomen. They come back here. There's a short-winged where the wings look to be only about half that length. The long-winged crickets have not only long wings, but they've got stronger flight muscles. They can disperse if conditions are poor. The difference is their gonads develop more slowly. The more energy you put into flight muscles and wings, the less energy is available for growing gonads. Short-winged crickets have larger gonads and more energy invested in reproduction. So if conditions are good, the short-winged can outcompete the long-winged. But if conditions are bad, the short-winged crickets are less likely to be able to escape. So again, you've got a trade-off. And we might predict that short-winged crickets will predominate in some environments and long-winged crickets will predominate in others. Each phenotype is going to be favored under different circumstances. Since I've mentioned sexual reproduction, by the way, now's a good time to stop and ask oneself, what's the point of sex in the first place? John Maynard Smith is one of the grand old figures of the evolutionary modern synthesis. And he pointed out that sex is costly. This is only partly because, the activities of seeking out mates and producing gametes involve investing energy, right? And, it costs money to buy all those flowers and candy and things like that, or do the things that other organisms do. But if you had a population of organisms that reproduced asexually, it should outcompete sexuals because every asexual can reproduce, whereas you need two sexuals to reproduce. Oftentimes, although not always, this is males and females, and organisms have to pair up in order to make babies. Whereas if you are asexual, every organism can make babies. And so if you had sexual and asexuals in the same population, the asexuals ought to outcompete the sexuals because the asexuals can reproduce twice as fast. That's the twofold cost of sex. So you'd think sexual reproduction wouldn't be favored because sexual organisms don't produce as many babies as asexuals do. And yet we find sexual reproduction is almost universal, certainly in animals, plants, and fungi. There aren't very many animals that never reproduce sexually. As we'll see, there's quite a lot that can switch off between asexual stages and sexual stages. But there aren't very many that have completely sworn off sex, that never have it. With plants, it can be a little more tricky. Dr. Noyes has studied a plant in Texas that has asexual and sexual individuals in the same populations and looked at why that's the case. But still, it's very common to find sexual reproduction in plants, certainly in fungi as well. So why is sexual reproduction so common if sexuals can't reproduce as fast as asexuals? Sexuals have to invest energy in sexual reproduction. And there's also the risk that sex stripped of to its absolute lowest common denominator, sex is genetic engineering. Sex is mingling the genes of two organisms to create a new organism with a different genotype. I like that. Sex is genetic engineering. And sexual organisms, there's always a risk that if they mingle their genes with a partner, the offspring are going to be less well adapted to their environment. So why is sexual reproduction nearly universal? Well, there's a couple of reasons. There's three big ones, in fact. One of them has to do with something we didn't talk about in the population genetics part of the course. And just for reasons of time, if you have, okay, think about this. Imagine that we have a human population where, okay, we have alleles for brown eyes and light eyes. Now, eye color is actually polygenic. There's at least three major genes that determine your eye color. To a very rough approximation, dark eyes are dominant and light are recessive. That doesn't always work. But right now, let's pretend that works. So let's say we have an allele, we have a gene for eye color, and let's say that that gene is very closely linked, like being right next to it on the chromosome. You remember genetic linkage. Let's say that the allele for blue eyes is located right next to an allele for absolutely revolting body odor. Well, hideous body odor is, tends to be detrimental to a human's chances of sexual reproduction. I trust I do not have to spell out why. And if we had the situation where the allele for blue eyes was genetically linked to the allele for stanky body odor, then we might expect the allele for blue eyes to become less common in the human population, not because there's selection on blue eyes, not because there's anything wrong with blue eyes, but because blue eyes has the rotten luck to be genetically linked with another gene that is being strongly selected against, the gene for body odor. That's what we call linkage disequilibrium. Allele frequencies for a particular gene may be out of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and they may be going up or going down, not because of that gene's effect on phenotype, but because that gene is genetically linked with another gene where there is selection going on. So that is linkage disequilibrium. And one of the things that sex does is it breaks up linkage disequilibrium. Because certainly in humans, when humans produce gametes, they go through meiosis, which involves all of that breaking and recombining of homologous parts of the chromosomes. Hopefully you remember what that is. And that means that there's at least a chance that, some people will have the alleles for blue eyes, but they won't be linked to the alleles for smelling like Satan's armpit on an Arkansas June day. That sexual reproduction breaks up genetic linkage, and it means that alleles may become more or less common, but not because they're closely linked to other alleles that are being selected on. So if blue eyes are favored, blue eyes can now increase in frequency and not be dragged down because they're genetically linked to an allele for bad body odor. So sex breaks up linkage disequilibrium. Sex breaks up Mueller's ratchet. Mueller was a Russian of German descent, one of the first back in the very early 20th century to look at mutations. Mueller showed that mutations result from things that physically damage the chromosome, like X-rays, for example. He was one of the ones, he might have been the first to make the link between mutation and certain types of radiation. And he pointed out that, well, he pointed out something that's now very obvious now that we have photocopiers. If you were to take a drawing and make a photocopy of it, and make a photocopy of the photocopy, and then make a photocopy of the photocopy of the photocopy, and then make a photocopy of the photocopy of the photocopy of the photocopy, every time you make a photocopy, you introduce a little distortion, probably a few little, scratches and blips and bloops and blobs and things. And when you make a photocopy of a photocopy, you're copying the old distortion and damage, the old bleeps and blops and specks and flecks, and adding new ones. And so photocopying, if you actually tried this after maybe 10 generations of photocopying, you'd have something that's absolute sludge. Because every time you duplicate, you add errors, and you've got no mechanism for taking errors away. Mueller pointed out that this applied to DNA as well. Every time you duplicate DNA, DNA is much more accurately replicated than any photocopier could do. But every time you duplicate DNA, there is a chance you're going to introduce a mutation. And mutations are often going to have a negative effect. And so if you duplicate DNA and then duplicate it again and again and again and again, at every asexual generation, there is a chance that you're going to add a mutation with a negative effect, and you've got no way to get rid of them. Now, it's called a ratchet because a ratchet is a toothed wheel that only turns in one direction. A socket wrench is a great example, right? You have a handle, and then you put the socket on the handle, and you can turn the handle relative to the socket if you push it in one direction, but you can't turn it if you push it in the other direction. That's a ratchet. There's a ratchet mechanism in a socket wrench. A ratchet is a wheel that only turns one way. And just as a ratchet wheel can only turn in one direction, an asexual line can only accumulate more and more and more mutations. Sexual reproduction breaks that up, right? If I've got negative mutation A in my DNA and my wife has negative mutation B and we have kids, at least some of those kids will be carrying neither. If I have negative mutation A and my wife, but good B, and my wife has good A, but negative B, then at least some of my kids will be carrying both good A and good B. At least some of our kids will inherit the good parts of both my wife's DNA and my DNA and won't get all of the bad parts. In fact, it's thought that sexual reproduction may have evolved way back in the time when there was nothing more complex than bacteria as basically a DNA repair mechanism. So sex breaks up linkage disequilibrium. It breaks Mueller's ratchet. And if the population is exposed to changing environments, Sexual reproduction generates variability. You're constantly shuffling your genetic deck and coming up with new gene combinations. This is Lee Van Valen at the University of Chicago, and he devised what he calls the Red Queen hypothesis. In the Red Queen hypothesis, the main driving force behind evolution is ecological interactions among species, predation, parasitism, disease, um, competition for resources. The main source of natural selection on a population is populations of other species. And every time one species adapts in some way, develops a new feature, a new trait, or something like that, that forces others in its ecosystem to adapt. If the predator develops slightly faster speed, then all of the prey have to evolve countermeasures, becoming slightly faster. If the predator evolves slightly stronger teeth, the prey might have to evolve slightly thicker armor. But then that will cause the predator to evolve even thicker teeth, which means the prey will evolve even thicker armor. And the point of this is when you have lots of species and a change in each one affects all of the others, every species constantly has to adapt just to hold on to the niche that it's got. A species is constantly under pressure to evolve just to keep one step ahead of its competitors, its parasites, its predators, and its pathogens. So a species in an environment like that has to change. To change, you have to have variability. And sex is a way that maintains variability. Um, and I should mention why it's called the Red Queen hypothesis. You've probably heard of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. And you might remember, even if you've only seen the Disney version, you might remember that part of this takes place in a really weird card game where you have the King of Hearts and the Queen of Hearts and the Knave of Hearts, that's the Jack. And there's that weird bit where everybody's playing croquet with flamingos and these animated cards are bending themselves into arches for the balls, which are hedgehogs, to roll through. Anyway, weird book. So Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is set in a weird card game. The sequel, Through the Looking Glass, is set in a weird chess game. And Alice encounters the White Knight and the Red Queen and the White Queen and all that. And here's Alice being dragged along by the Red Queen. I should mention that in chess sets of this time, the pieces were red and white, not black and white. And there's a moment where the Red Queen starts running and drags Alice along behind her. That's what you see in this illustration. And when they finally can stop running, the scenery is completely unchanged. And Alice says, you know, and where I'm from, when I run, I usually get somewhere. And the Red Queen says, that's stupid. Here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. So just as the Red Queen has to run very fast just to hold her position, the same is true of living things. They've got to adapt as fast as they can simply to hold the niche space that they've got. What's this got to do with sex? Well, Curtis Lively and company did a study several years ago of a snail that's native to New Zealand called Potamopicus antipodarum. And in this particular species, you can have sexuals and asexuals in the same population. This map right here, these are the two islands of New Zealand. And it looks like it's got a bunch of pins stuck in it. Each one of these pins marks the location of a snail population. And the head of each pin is actually a tiny pie chart. And it may be a little hard to see, but right there, that's a little pie chart. And the area that's shaded in blue is the frequency of asexual snails, and the bit that's shaded in white is shows you the frequency of sexual snails. So you have some areas where virtually every snail is an asexual, and you have others where there's a sizable amount of sexual snails. And it turns out that on the y-axis here, you have the frequency of males in the population. That's an incidence of how much sexual reproduction there is. And on the x-axis, you've got the incidence of infection with flatworm parasites. The reason that's significant, by the way, is that flatworm parasites go through a stage where they live inside snails, and they often do something called parasitic castration, which is exactly what it sounds like. Parasitic worms eat your gonads. And if parasitic worms eat your gonads, you are an evolutionary dead end. You're never going to reproduce at all. And it turns out that sexual individuals are most common in populations with a high parasite load. Think about this. If you're asexual and everybody is the same, a parasite that can infect one member of the population can rapidly infect everybody. It's like if you all had computers and everybody had the same password, and everybody had the same password 123, then any hacker that cracked one of your computers could crack all of them very quickly. Sex is the equivalent of changing your password, is you're generating new combinations of genes, new combinations of alleles. Sexual reproduction is like changing your password every month. And in a sexual population where the passwords are all different and they're all changing, then a hacker that cracks one of your computers is not going to have an advantage at breaking into any of the others. Thus it is for sex. If you have a sexually reproducing population, a parasite that's very effective at infecting one won't necessarily be effective at infecting all. So there is quite a lot of scatter in the data, but by and large, the higher the parasite load, the greater the incidence of sexual reproduction. There's some more recent work by Maureen Nyman, who produces very funny t-shirts for her lab. There's a couple of snakes engaging in asexual harassment. And it turns out that asexual lineages of the snail accumulate mutations at about twice the rate of sexual populations. And that seems to support Mueller's ratchet. Sexual organisms can purge their genomes of mutations that have a bad effect, deleterious mutations, as we say. Oof, okay. The advantage of I'm almost done, we'll take a break. The advantage of asexual reproduction, again, is that it's faster, and a lot of organisms that exploit rich resources but don't have much time will switch it. You get this in gall aphids, for example. There's sumac galls, and you might recall that the sexual stage of these aphids takes place down in the moss. And when a female lays, a female that's reproduced sexually lays eggs in the sumac leaf, and those eggs hatch into aphids that will reproduce asexually inside the gall. So they'll crank up their numbers inside this gall, but eventually they'll burst out and reproduce sexually. And that way the aphids are like Miley Cyrus, because they get the best of both worlds. Sorry about that. I think I already made that joke in lab. Next time I'll do the Van Halen with Sammy Hagar song about getting the best of both worlds. Anyway, so gall aphids will switch between a sexual stage that creates genetic diversity and an asexual stage where they crank up their numbers. You get this in things like flies that live on mushrooms. lots of food on a mushroom, very little time to exploit it. So they'll go asexual while they're chowing down on the mushroom and switch to sexual when the mushroom food starts running out. And you get a lot of this in parasites as well. This is a snail. I guess it's photographed in a jar of water with a curved wall, so it looks a little distorted, but that's a snail. And this is a snail that's been infected with a parasitic flatworm. And all of these little floating gray specks in the water is Cercaria larvae of a flatworm fluke being released from a snail. These will swim through the water, and the lucky ones, probably very few, will find their way into a vertebrate host. And exactly how they do that varies, depends on what species you've got. Once they have colonized a vertebrate host, sexual reproduction will take place there. So they go through asexual stages in a snail, where they're capable of cranking up their numbers like you wouldn't believe. And the lucky ones will make it to a vertebrate host where sexual reproduction takes place. So there too, you have the best of both worlds. You have the advantage of being able to crank up your numbers and the advantage of generating genetic diversity in the sexual stage. And you actually see that quite a lot. Right. I've got straight up 10. I kind of went a little bit longer than I usually do. I will now stop the recording.